All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see everyone here. The place is full. Hope everyone's got enough standing room. Is everyone comfortable where they are? Good. It's good to see everyone. They are two men who have changed the conversation forever. Whenever we here at the CeBIT Global Conferences or anywhere on the planet now talk about our privacy, our data, our right to be seen, our right not to be seen, our right to be known, our right to be forgotten, their signatures are now on every conversation piece. I'm talking about Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald, the whistleblower and his gatekeeper. And today, they are here with us physically and virtually. And they're here to answer questions and to help us think out loud about a brave new world that no one asked us to join just yet. So I'd like for you to give a warm round of applause to our first guest today, Mr. Glenn Greenwald. Hi, Glenn. Hi. The Gatekeeper.
That was an interesting title that you chose for me.
Well, I didn't choose the title. You have been called that ever since this affair broke, ever since you helped get the information out. Is it a title that you accept?
Sure. I mean, it's another way of saying journalist. Journalists every single day make choices about information that's in their possession that they think should be disclosed to the public and the public interest, or should not be. When you have a source who comes to you, they often say, this is information I'm giving to you that you're not authorized to disclose. This is information I want you to disclose, and this is information that you need to decide. So when Snowden came to both myself and Laura Poitras, he said, here's a massive archive of documents. Obviously, if I wanted to, I could just upload the whole thing to the internet. He didn't want to do that because he didn't think that would be a responsible way to handle the material. He asked us to carefully evaluate it, working with journalistic institutions, and that's what we've done. And I think it would be incredibly irresponsible to have done anything else.
And why haven't you released everything?
Well, there's information in there that would be, I think, ethically grotesque to release. For example, there's information that the NSA collected that contains private persons' emails or transcripts of their telephone conversations or accusations that they're engaged in some sort of terrorist activity. It would be horrible for us to just upload all of that to the internet and further violate those people's privacy.
Do you ever feel like, though, Glenn, that you're violating their privacy? Because obviously you have access to that information, and the people whose privacy was violated, they never gave permission for you to see that either.
There are tens of thousands of people with top secret clearance inside the US and the British governments who also have access to that information. So I think that having me as a journalist have access to the information doesn't do very much additionally to their privacy. But I think that we've taken great steps to protect people's privacy by showing the world the extent to which there's invasions taking place.
Is the world we live in today better because of what you and Laura and the great whistleblower himself, Edward Snowden, because of what you guys did? Is the world a better place?
Sure. I mean, just on the level of democracy alone, I mean, no matter what your view is on the proper extent of surveillance, just the fact that you had these governments engaged in this extraordinarily consequential behavior, turning the internet into a realm of mass surveillance, and doing that completely in the dark so that we in so-called democracies can't actually debate whether we want them to. The fact that we've been able to inform people around the world about what has been taking place, I think regardless of your views on secrecy or surveillance or privacy or terrorism, itself is an enormous value if you believe in democracy. And I think we're very content and gratified at what we've been able to achieve.
Do you consider yourself a Democrat? Not in the political party term, but as a supporter of democracy.
Sure.
What about when you go back to the United States and you get the criticism that you're not a patriot?
You know, one of probably my single childhood hero was Danny Ellsberg, who 45 years ago took tens of thousands of top secret documents that prove that the US government was systematically lying to its own population about the Vietnam War, and did exactly what Edward Snowden did, which is instead of releasing them all on his own, he gave them to journalists at the New York Times and asked the Times to report it, and they did. And what was said about Daniel Ellsberg was that he was a traitor, he was somebody who endangered national security, who was irresponsible, who put troops in harm's way. Everything that's being said about Edward Snowden and those of us who have worked on the journalism was said about Daniel Ellsberg, then it was said about Chelsea Manning, it was said about every whistleblower who came forward and exposed the torture program in the United States government, the abuses at Abu Ghraib. I'm really proud to be in that group, and we knew that we would be accused of exactly the same things they were.
Are you the Daniel Ellsberg of the 21st century?
I think Edward Snowden is, and I think Chelsea Manning is, and I think the people who work inside government, and they're really the ones who take the greatest legal risk. And instead of remaining complicit with grave injustices by remaining silent about them or working within the system, instead risk unraveling their whole lives and their liberty to tell their fellow citizens about what's taking place. I think those people are heroes of democracy, and I certainly include Snowden and Manning along with Ellsberg in that group.
Your critics say that you have too much power, that no one elected you to be the gatekeeper, to be the arbiter of this information.
Yeah, actually, there's this thing called the U.S. Constitution, and the First Amendment to it guarantees a free press. And that Constitution was democratically ratified by the United States, and virtually every country in the Western world outside of the UK has a similar protection embedded within their defining document that guarantees a free press. And the purpose of a free press is to do exactly what we're doing, which is oftentimes people in political power will use their power to conceal the things they're doing that ought to remain public. And you can't have a democracy if they're allowed to do that without any pushback. And so the role of the journalist, which is ratified in all sorts of ways, including by guaranteeing a free press, is to shine a light on what those people are doing that they're trying to hide, and that's the role we play.
What about that light of journalists right now? How would you describe the condition of journalism in 2015?
Well, I mean, for me, it's really defined by what I think is one of the greatest political crimes of our generation, if not the greatest political crime, which is the invasion by the U.S. and the British government and their allies of Iraq and the subsequent destruction of Iraq. And when people think about that episode, they typically think about it as a situation where major governments around the world lied to their own population in order to justify a war. And that was a big part of that story, but at least as big a part of that story is the role that journalists played in not just failing to investigate those false claims, but helping to disseminate them. And to me, that was a byproduct of the fact that our largest media institutions have become far too close to and subservient to governments and those who wield the greatest power, and journalism is supposed to be a check on and an adversary to power centers, not a servant of it. And so one of the things we tried to do with how we've done the reporting is to revitalize this idea of adversarial journalism.
How do you ensure that journalists are independent?
Well, I think it's all about how you view your role. And if you're willing to allow governments or corporations to dictate to you how you're going to make disclosures or what it is that you're going to say, then I think you've lost your independence. You've sacrificed it. And I think if you instead see yourself as somebody who's there to act as an adversary to governments, not to be their friend and not to be their partner and their collaborator, but to be someone who pushes back against them, then I think you'll have independence as a journalist.
What about big money? Your project, The Intercept, you're funded by the eBay billionaire. Can you tell the world that you're able to work as a journalist without any influence from this man who has incredibly deep pockets?
Sure. I mean, we would all quit the very second that any interference was ever attempted. And that's why I say independence is something that is about the role that you envision yourself performing. Unfortunately, one of the things I learned over the last 18 months is that if you want to do real journalism, You know, if you want to challenge the US government or the most secretive agency of the world's most powerful governments or the largest corporations, you need resources. You need editors who help you do the journalism and reporters with whom you work and people who are going to do your operational security. I think in the last 18 months, our legal fees alone from doing the Snowden reporting have been many, many, many millions of dollars. And so it would be great if there were a world in which you could challenge these large institutions without lots of resources, but that's not the world we live in. And so the question becomes, how do you make sure you're well-financed enough to do real aggressive journalism and are protected from the threats that you'll face, while at the same time maintaining your independence? And I think that's just a matter of how much personal conviction you have in your own independence.
Your definition of journalism, is it the traditional one that you and I grew up in the United States with, or it sounds like you're describing advocacy journalism, that you think journalists should have a cause and they should go out and they should pursue that cause?
Well, there's this conception of journalism that is, I think, predominant in most Western countries, certainly in the US and the UK, and I think to a large extent even in Germany, that says the role of the journalist is to be neutral. You're objective. You don't take sides.
Wait,
you don't.
Isn't that what we learned?
Well, there are a lot of things we learned that are inaccurate, but I think the important thing to think about.
But I mean, come on.
No, but I think the important thing to realize is that this is a very new conception of journalism.
Right.
It's treated as though it's the obvious, long-standing conception of what journalism is supposed to be, and it's not. If you look at how freedom of the press was regarded 300 years ago when it was first talked about as a concept, it was not something that this small cloistered profession called journalists practiced, where you go to work for large corporations and you remain neutral and completely devoid of passion. It was the opposite. It was something that individual citizens, all of us, could use. You use the printing press to work against those in power, to confront injustice, to crusade for just outcomes. This is how journalism and newspapers and the printing press were used for many, many decades when they were first disseminated in the West. It's really only once journalism started to become heavily corporatized, when large corporations started owning our biggest media outlets, did those values of corporations, avoid controversy, don't alienate people in power, say nothing that might offend anybody, began to take hold. And I think it's really drained journalism of its vibrancy and passion and made it quite boring and quite neutered. And the effects have been pretty obvious.
Well, the notion of transparency, is there a way of having too much transparency?
Well, sure. I mean, you began by calling me the gatekeeper, by which you meant that I didn't take all of the documents that Edward Snowden gave me and just upload them indiscriminately to the internet. So I think the fact that we didn't do that, and we didn't do it in part because Snowden insisted that we not do it, but also because we believe our duties as journalists and citizens would be violated, shows that we do believe that there's some legitimate secrecy, that some things don't need to be disclosed and probably shouldn't be.
But who should decide that, Glenn? I think that's what everyone's debating right now. Who decides what is legitimately classified and is not?
Well, in democracies, we have different people deciding these things. We don't have just one person deciding them. So in the first instance, governments get to make that decision. And in the 9/11 era, we have gone so far over to the extreme end of state secrecy, where virtually, literally everything that the government does of any significance is reflexively marked classified or confidential or secret and concealed from the public, which is a very unhealthy, I would say unviable way to have a democracy. And so when I sit up at night worrying about things, I don't worry about, do we have too much transparency? I worry about the extreme and pervasive secrecy that we have. And so you need a check, because people in power will be inclined to hide the things that are embarrassing to them or that they do wrong. And so one of those checks is courts, another one is a parliament or a Congress, and another one is a free press. And so it's never one person who makes those decisions.
Is there a danger that with every revelation that comes to light, with every document that you let become part of public discourse, are we in danger of pushing organizations such as the NSA into a corner further and further, knowing that their technology will always be superior to ours. That the more we reveal, the more we force our world into a state of surveillance. That at the end of the day, someone could say you've actually hurt more than help everybody.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I follow the reasoning, but let me say this. It's virtually impossible to imagine a world in which we could have made the state of surveillance worse. The motto of the NSA, their institutional motto, the way like football teams adopt a motto, the NSA's motto is collect it all. Not collect lots of it or collect the terrorist communications, it's collect it all. Between the NSA and the GCHQ and their partners in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, they are collecting billions of telephone and email communications,
and you said that
and internet events every day,
right?
Every single day. And so, when we started off, we weren't worried about how we could make surveillance worse. And I think one of the things that has happened is people like the people at this conference and individual internet users around the world now understand much more about methods of surveillance and are able to safeguard against them and are doing so in a way that walls have been created between these governments and our internet activities.
We're in Germany. A lot of Germans wanted Edward Snowden to be granted asylum here. That has not happened. Do you think Germany has let the free world down?
Sure. I think that there's been a lot of great things that have happened over the last 20 months as a result of these disclosures. But I think one of the most disappointing things, and I think the history of this event will regard this as a shameful episode, is that the countries and the governments that have most benefited from the risks that Edward Snowden took, which certainly includes the German government, which learned about the ways in which they themselves have been the subject of surveillance, their populations, their companies, their communication infrastructure. They've learned about how to safeguard against that surveillance. The countries such as Germany that have benefited the most from the risks that he took are the same ones that have most shamefully turned their back on him. And it has been really, I think, horrifying to watch someone like Edward Snowden risk his liberty and life, massive risks, to protect the privacy rights of the people of Germany and the government of Germany, and then have the German government refuse to take any minimal risk, any kind of increased tension with the United States to turn around and protect his rights the way that he's protected theirs. I definitely think this has been shameful.
Have you been able to talk to any German lawmakers about this? Because the irony of what we're saying here is that you're in a country that is known around the world. We hear that at the global conferences every year. The Germans are the champions of data protection on the planet. Mm-hmm. The standards that they advocate are the toughest standards in the world. And you're saying they're not walking the talk.
Well, as it turns out, as it happens, I was at an event 3 days ago in Hamburg, where I spoke at an event, and also present at this event was the Vice Chancellor of Germany, Mr. Gabriel. And he stood up in his speech before I spoke, and he said, "Isn't it terrible that Edward Snowden has to resort to going to Vladimir Putin's autocratic Russia in order to have his rights protected, as though he just couldn't think of a solution that might lead to a different outcome."
What'd you say to him?
Well, someone in the audience said, "I have an idea, why don't you bring him here?" And he gave some kind of very shifty, evasive answer about legal protections and a court process that didn't strike me as true. And afterwards, I spoke to him myself, and I said, asylum is an internationally recognized universal power that all governments have. The U.S. grants asylum all the time to people accused of crimes in their home country and claims they're being persecuted. Why can't you do that? And he really did not have any sort of an answer. And I think the obvious answer that everyone knows is that when choosing between what they claim they believe in and alienating the U.S. government even slightly, the German government chooses subservience to the U.S. government over the political values they claim to share.
And is that what's happening? I mean, are you saying that the German Chancellor Angela Merkel is knowingly being subservient to the NSA and to Washington when she says, no, I'm not going to discuss bringing Edward Snowden to this country?
Is that even in controversy? I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that that's the case. I mean, I do think that governments like Germany and France and Brazil and India, some of the countries that have benefited most from Edward Snowden's disclosure, do have a different incentive in not giving him asylum, which is they are afraid of taking whistleblowers and venerating them too much and turning them into heroes because they don't want their own Edward Snowdens inside their governments coming forward and disclosing their secrets as well. They have an interest in maintaining this kind of superiority of authority that says that once we say something secret, no one has the right to disclose it. But I think the bigger consideration is the US government remains the most powerful government on earth, and there's not a lot of political benefit for someone like Angela Merkel to get into a very public dispute with the United States over something that she probably regards as trivial as Edward Snowden's political rights.
Is that something you've seen in all the documents that you have access to, that you're privy to? Have you seen that other countries do have their Edward Snowdens, and it just hasn't come to light yet?
Well,
I mean, do you know of Germany, for example, having an Edward Snowden who's just waiting to, let that big information leak?
I mean, I'm not going to talk about people who have been inspired by Edward Snowden to come forward and share secrets with us or other journalists because there's obviously a danger that they face, except to say that there have been people who have been inspired by Edward Snowden, who have come forward and are starting to work with journalists and share secrets that they think.
Can you say any in Germany?
I'm not going to preview it or give hints about them or play 20 questions or anything like that. But I think that's one of the important parts of the Edward Snowden legacy is I do think it will inspire, it has inspired other people to do similar things. And I think governments, not just the United States, but others are very wary of that, and they probably should be.
Yesterday, Jeremy Rifkin was here and talking about his vision of the future. And I asked him about Edward Snowden and what Edward Snowden had done. And he said that the great thing about what Edward Snowden has done is that he has shown us not only are we being watched, but the technology also exists now for us to watch back. Is that the world we should be striving for? Two-way surveillance?
Yeah, I mean, yes. And one of the, if you think about it, if you think about transparency and privacy, people sometimes make the critique, well, it's a little bit hypocritical that you're advocating for privacy when you've sort of violated the NSA's privacy, right? Like we took all their documents and published them to the world. But people who wield political power in the public sector have an obligation of transparency. That's why they're called public officials.
Right.
And people who are private citizens don't have an obligation of privacy. They have of transparency. They have the right to privacy, which is why they're called private citizens. Private citizens are supposed to have privacy. Public officials are supposed to have transparency. We have completely reversed that so that we now know almost nothing about what our governments are doing while they know everything about what we're doing. It's supposed to be the other way around. And I think to the extent that journalism and whistleblowers start to shine a light back on them where it belongs in the first place, the healthier we'll be.
What about countries such as Russia, such as China, where we could not even have this conversation? Where's the criticism of these countries? Your critics say that you're shooting at an easy target, that the NSA, the United States, Europe are easy targets because they are relatively open compared to countries such as Russia and China.
I mean, if you live in the West, you are continuously subjected to all sorts of denunciations of the countries that are considered the bad countries, meaning the countries that don't comply with the dictates of the US and the West. So we hear every day and have heard for many, many years, every day, about the tyranny of China and Russia and Iran and North Korea. None of that is a secret to any citizen of the West. What was missing from that conversation is the fact that it isn't just China and Russia and Iran and North Korea spying on their own citizens. It's our own government doing it as well. And as a citizen of the United States and as a journalist who works in the West, I think my obligation is to inform the public debate, to correct propaganda, and to report on the bad things my own government is doing. And so I think that has been really important to show the people of the West that it's not just those countries we always hear about doing these things, but our own governments do them very frequently as well.
Are we being told the truth, do you think, Glenn, about the threat of terror and terrorism to us in the West? Or is that being used to justify all the surveillance that you're talking about?
I mean, if you go and look at political theorists and people who debated the formation of countries, almost universally they recognize that the greatest danger to political rights and political liberties inside a country is that the people who wield political power will exaggerate the threats posed externally in order to scare the population and get them to submit to things to which they otherwise would be quite resistant. If you are a citizen of Germany or of Great Britain or of Canada or the United States, you have a greater chance of dying by being struck by lightning or slipping in a bathtub and hitting your head on the ceramic tile, or by going out to dinner tonight and contracting a fatal intestinal illness than you do dying in a terrorist attack. And yet we're radically dismantling our political system and our conception of political liberty in the name of this threat that, although horrible to watch, is actually quite remote from any rational perspective.
And is it the government? Are they responsible for putting that message out? Or are we back to the journalist again, people like you and me? Are we responsible for this, what you say is this warped perception of what the dangers are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think that it goes to a lot of different things. I mean, I think human beings tend to be very tribalistic, and we like to talk about how terrible the people over there are who are different from us and all the terrible things they're doing, and we're much less comfortable talking about the bad things that we ourselves are doing. So I think this is part of the imbalance. But there's absolutely a strong incentive for Western governments to put their populations in fear of external threats because they then have much more latitude to be able to do whatever it is that they want to do.
I have to ask you, before we go and talk to Edward, I have to ask you about what's coming up in the United States. Hillary Clinton, for example, she, if she gets through the email scandal, she will probably be the Democratic nominee for president in 2016. You have come down very hard on her. You don't see her as one of these flashlights that should be turned on the system.
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of people learned their lesson from President Obama. Just today there was an article that said that more documents have been declared secret and more requests for freedom of information have been denied under President Obama than in any administration throughout history. I think people have come to the lesson in Germany especially, which was drunk with adoration for President Obama 8 years ago, that often the branding and imagery that politicians are present is much different than what they will actually do in power. So I think anybody who's vying for the level of political power that she wants to attain deserves a huge amount of scrutiny and should not be sort of taken at faith that what they're saying they intend to do or who they are is actually true, but they should actually be investigated. I think it's true of every journalist, but for every citizen, but particularly for a journalist.
I have to ask you this before we go to Edward. When you and I were at university in the United States, we learned about Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson even said, he was considered a radical of his time. He thought that every generation should have its own revolution, because he said that was the only way to cleanse the system from all the diseases that come from the establishment. Are you advocating a type of revolution in the West to cleanse ourselves of this obsession with surveillance?
I mean, it depends what you mean by revolution. I mean, I don't think, I think that bloody sort of violent rebellions against authority have their own massive risks. Although I do think it is notable that the people who founded the United States, which calls itself the leader of the free world, were essentially called and regarded as terrorists of their time. They were engaged in violence against the prevailing authority. But to the extent that revolution means constantly reevaluating orthodoxy and convention and trying to get to the root of propaganda and being open to fundamentally changing how we view the world, I think that is an extremely healthy and even necessary process.
And you don't think we're going to have a revolution at the ballot box in 2016?
By electing Hillary Clinton or someone like her?
By electing Hillary Clinton?
No, I would not call the election of Hillary Clinton a revolution.
Hillary Clinton, okay, very good. All right, Edward Snowden is with us now, I've been told. Edward, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Edward, welcome. Are you on the screen? There. Can we see Edward? Ah, there you are. Edward, hi, welcome. Hi. Edward, you know, you obviously have a large room here of people in support of you. We are in Germany, and you can't be with us on this stage. Do you feel let down by the German government?
I think whenever there's a kind of a political challenge we face like this, where there's clear public support, there's kind of a universal public opinion about how we should move in relation to resolving surveillance problems, privacy problems, confronting issues with the general weakness of the modern asylum right. It's not something that we should express disappointment in. It's not something that we should go, oh, you know, I'm sad about this because I haven't gotten my optimal goal. Instead, we need to think about it as an opportunity. You know, engineers, scientists, they look for unanswered questions. They look for unanswered problems. What we're seeing in the wake of 2013 is not really about surveillance. It's about democracy. It's about the fact that increasingly, governments view themselves as a particular elite class, which has a different set of interests from the public broadly. There's no question that, shall we say, the political establishment of the German federal government is not aware of the public's opinion on the issue of protection of the asylum right for people who have revealed evidence of serious wrongdoing or crimes. However, the German government is not willing to defend that, even when they realize it's quite likely no costs would be imposed. In my case, specifically, were I to talk about that, one of the sort of defenses that's been provided is that the United States government would be outraged. You know, they would take some kind of action, some consequences against the German government in retaliation. But is that really realistic? I mean, Germany is, for all intents and purposes, the leader of the European Union. They're an advanced democracy. They're a strong ally. They're a strong economy. And they have a quite well-established tradition of defending individual and collective rights.
But do you not think, Edward, that they would be, that Germany, that the leaders of Germany, do you not think that they fear that there would be real and serious consequences for the government and for the security of Germany if they were to grant you asylum?
I don't think so, no. I'm sure they've been, that's been communicated through both official channels and unofficial channels. But I mean, these are savvy politicians. We're talking about Angela Merkel. She's not some new person who's never seen this kind of international signaling.
Well, you know, she's been criticized at home a lot, though, for being the chancellor who had a phone that was, you know, that could be tapped by the NSA.
Right, but that doesn't mean that she's politically naive. That's talking about sort of security implications, which we've got to remember in the context before June of 2013, this was kind of a dark art. Yes, intelligence services would provide warning. Yes, there are counterintelligence officials who would write reports about this. Yes, there are technology researchers who have published papers for years and years and years about the potential of the threat. But we didn't expect that this would really be happening. And we got to remember, this isn't just Germany. This also happened in the White House. We have here a story that was published just a few days ago, which is the very first public confirmation, I believe, from a National Security Council meeting in the United States, where you've got an exchange between Susan Rice and Director Keith Alexander of the National Security Agency, where when the story broke, the White House's response wasn't, how do we handle this? It was, why were you listening to Angela Merkel's phone? And Keith Alexander, director of the NSA, said, because you told us to. These agencies, these practices had become invisible, not just to the public, not just to people like Angela Merkel, but within the White House itself. The problem is classification becomes so ordinary, so routine. And this is through policy. This is not through some kind of maliciousness or nefarious intent. That people like me sitting at NSA in Hawaii, our plans for lunch are literally classified because you're required by policy to put your identification, which office you work for, what your secure phone number is, what your title is, what your target set is, for example, me working against China, all in every single email. So they've got some sort of official record there, but that block, that identification block, is itself classified. So there are almost no documents being produced within the intelligence community that are not classified, which means even with people who should know about these things, who should have awareness of it, even at the highest levels of government, nobody knows what's going on.
Let me ask you what I asked Glenn earlier, this notion that the good thing that has come out of what you have done is that the world is now aware that there is this technology that not only allows us to be surveyed upon, but also allows us to look back and to shine a light on those who do not want us to know what they're doing to us or with our information. Do you agree with that? I mean, have we been empowered by what you have done?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you have more complete access to information, you can reach better quality decisions. The real problem in the pre-sort of 2013 period was this disparity of information. Intelligence agencies knew everything about everyone. We didn't even know they were watching us. That kind of indiscriminate dragnet collection of everybody's private communications, whether or not they're actually being read, creates a gigantic division, a gigantic disparity, not just in capability, not just in social power, but simply understanding of the kind of world we live in. We were removed from the ability to even know that these policies had been enacted without our knowledge or consent. We didn't know that we needed to think about who we were calling in the middle of the night because it might signal to our own government or an adversary government something about our own human relationships, our associations, our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities, our hopes, and our loves.
Edward, let me ask you, it's been reported that you've let it be known that you'd like to come home, that you want to leave Russia, you want to go back to the United States. Is anything being done right now that you can tell us that would make a return to the United States possible on your terms?
I think the reality here is that there is no dictation. There's no my terms and their terms. Ultimately, the reason that I try to go home to the United States is that while that's obviously my own personal hope, individually, I want to be home. I think it's the best resolution for the federal government and the public broadly. We don't want to be the kind of government where people who reveal serious wrongdoing have to seek shelter in other countries to see any kind of justice.
But do you have faith in the justice system, Edward? I mean, do you have faith that if you go home, that let's say if you were to go back to the United States and face these charges and stand trial, do you have faith that a jury would maybe perhaps find you guilty, but the sentence would be, let's say, 1 day in prison or something like that to show?
You're talking about in the United States?
Yeah, if you were to go back to the United States, yeah.
And he would have a 1 day sentence from...
Well, let's just say that a jury would actually say, okay, he broke the law, but he is a defender of the spirit of the law.
So I understand the question. What I would have to say is that this is what we would hope would be possible. Unfortunately, it's not possible procedurally. For example, in the United States, under the current law right now, it's not even possible for me to enjoy a fair trial. Even if I say, no negotiation at all, just let me come and face the charges, I want to tell the jury why I did it. I want to tell the court what these programs are. I want the jury to decide whether it was right or wrong that our rights and our Constitution were being violated in secret on a massive historic
But why do
scale.
you think a jury
I'm
would not be able?
forbidden from doing that.
But why, Edward? Why do you think a jury would not be able to do that? There are
The law
many.
forbids it. The law literally forbids it.
Can I just
Sure, go ahead.
quickly?
Go ahead.
He's charged with this 1917 statute
right.
called the Espionage Act.
Yes.
And who thinks that what he did was espionage, right? Even if you think what he did was wrong, he didn't pass any secrets to foreign governments. He gave it to journalists. But anyway, under this law, they've written the law so that if you're somebody like him who wants to go into court and say, yes, I disclosed secrets, and the reason I did it was because these secrets were corruptly kept in the first place. They should never have been kept secret, and therefore I was justified in doing what I did, which is what people in Washington keep daring him to come home and say.
Right.
He's barred under the law even from raising that as a defense. No judge would allow him to even utter those words in front of a jury because once the government says something secret, if you disclose it, you're guilty under the statute, regardless of whether it should have been kept secret, regardless of whether you were justified. So he can't make that argument to a jury.
What about striking a deal the way Petraeus has been able to do? Is that something? Or some people have argued that the deal that Petraeus has gotten is part of a path that is being paved for you to return to the United States under a similar deal.
That's new to me. That would be quite interesting. I do think, in general, many people have criticized the Petraeus deal because it shows a fundamental unfairness in the justice system. We have ordinary working-level individuals who reveal information to the press because they believe it's related to bad policy, criminal activity, serious wrongdoing. People like Thomas Drake, like Stephen Kim, like John Kiriakou, Chelsea Manning, all of these individuals who have put themselves, their reputations, their freedoms on the line to tell the public something that they felt was very important. And they've faced life in prison for this. I mean, when you talk about 10 years per count, and in the government, per count is per document on these things. It's really incredible that ordinary people face that, but then a general, for example, General Cartwright, who revealed the Stuxnet program, which was hacking the Iranian nuclear program in the run-up to the 2012 election, to sort of shine up the president's credentials on foreign policy, he's faced no charges at all. General Petraeus, of course, he provided information that's even more highly classified than anything that I provided to journalists. And, they said I stole the crown jewels, the keys to the kingdom. He provided things of a higher classification to his lover so she could write a more flattering biography, sort of a hagiography of him. And he's getting, of course, a deal that includes no prison time, a very nominal fine, which he could make up in a single speaking.
And you don't think anything like that is possible for you or will be possible for you as Obama's time in office nears its end?
I don't know, but it's not really up to me. What I would say is I think the importance of the Petraeus thing is if we can normalize this in the context of ordinary people at the working level, people who do this for the public good rather than for personal benefit. If that level of discretion is provided in the process where we no longer have this question of, okay, they either have to seek asylum or they have to face a show trial that involves secret evidence and secret witnesses, with no due process, we'll have a better chance of engagement that prevents sort of this conflict, this tension between governments and between the public. And I think that would be beneficial in the long run.
What about the possibility, though, of President Obama granting you some sort of clemency so that you can come home? Is that something that's being discussed?
There's been a lot of discussion about pardon and clemency in sort of elite circles. The New York Times called for it. I believe The Guardian called for it. There's... I think it's well established that this is something that the public broadly around the world would see as one way to resolve the issue. But it's not up to me to opine or decide. I don't want to influence this process.
But are you pushing for that, Edward? Are you pushing for some
Well,
sort of
that would be
party.
attorneys. I mean, I can't call the White House, unfortunately.
But your lawyers can in the U.S. I mean, are they working on getting something like that for you
You
before
have to
Obama leaves
ask
the White
them.
House?
I mean, I can't talk about that kind of stuff in a public conference. Obviously, any resolution that I think would be mutually beneficial is something that we would be open to pursue. I volunteered to go to prison to get this resolved, but the government has sort of an interior conflict between the intelligence community and sort of the political community,
Yeah.
where the intelligence community is concerned about deterrent. They're concerned about the fact, as we discussed earlier, everything is classified. Anybody can find indications of wrongdoing, of fraud, of waste that have been classified inappropriately. And if they don't have this life prison term as sort of a stick to keep people in line, they're concerned about the next step. And that's understandable. But the way I look at that is, do we really want the overclassification problem to be dictating sort of the future direction of our society, of our government, and of ultimately our justice system? I think that's far outside the wheelhouse of the intelligence community.
I have to ask you this, Edward. When the announcement was made that you were going to talk with us, I got a lot of emails from people asking me to ask you about a comment that Senator Feinstein made. She said that you could have come to her and that you could have told her about what you knew, and that a way would have been found for that information to be brought to light without you having to break federal law. What do you
I would
say?
say that
Is she lying?
She's intentionally sort of playing political theater because the reality is,
Which is his way of saying yes. by
Yes,
the way.
I mean, I'm trying to. Yeah. Okay. I mean,
Look, when we think about this broadly, Senator Feinstein is saying this, but she was already briefed on these programs. She was already aware of these programs. She was not part of the solution. She was a part of the problem. She was a part of this small, narrow community within the government, a sort of deep state, which was keeping secrets of obviously phenomenal public importance, not just in the United States, but around the world, based on the sort of the reaction we had from this. And she was keeping that buried. So had I come to her and told her this information, I would have lost my job. I would have been removed from access. I possibly would have faced charges on some technicality of how I had handled the information and how I got it to her. And so not only would I have ended up in prison, the public never would have known. Is that really a better solution? For Dianne Feinstein, yes, she might think that's true, but I think the public has a different answer.
so you're saying in the United States right now, the way the justice system is, the way the legal system is, there is no safe way for a concerned citizen to bring to light acts of government that are wrong.
I mean, I don't think that's a controversial assertion. We have a case history to look at this. Again, the case of Thomas Drake is particularly instructive here. This is an individual where they had in unclassified notes in their home that the government then, when they raided their home, pulled this person out and threatened them with life in prison, they retroactively classified these things in order to have something to charge him with. The case eventually collapsed when the story got into the newspapers and there was widespread outrage. But this is after that individual had been bankrupted. This is after this individual had lost their job. And they were a senior executive in the National Security Agency. This is somebody at a very high level who is now, today, they work at an Apple store at a normal clerical level because their reputation has been destroyed for doing what everybody publicly, including the government, agrees was absolutely the right thing to do. The government simply disagreed with how they handled the information. They say there's some technical parsing here, but really we need to be thinking about public ends. We need to be thinking about how do we confront the problem and how do we prevent sort of this civil resistance that's occurring increasingly within the intelligence apparatus within the United States. We have all of these unofficial leaks. We have all of these unauthorized leaks because there is no meaningful working process by which this information can be revealed in an appropriate and effective manner that gets problems resolved.
Well, what do you think?
Nobody like me stands up and self-nominates to burn their life to the ground just for kicks. People do this because they know there's something extraordinarily wrong that must be addressed, because it doesn't matter whether or not I can sleep well at night. It doesn't matter whether or not I'm privileged and I have a good job. It matters what's going to happen to my family.
Edward,
what's going to happen to everybody else in my country? What's going to happen to everybody who has to live under these policies for the next 10 or 50 years? I'm not going to be a part of that.
Do you feel like, when you look back at what's happened, I mean, I'm going to use your words, do you feel like you've burned your life to the ground by doing what you've done?
Yes, but I would do it again. The thing about burning something down is it's actually a little bit like crop rotation. It provides room for new growth. I lost what I had. There's no question about that. But I also had a new and I think incredibly fulfilling way to contribute now and to try to correct these problems that myself and so many in my offices, my colleagues around me, wanted to address, but simply didn't have the power to do so.
Right.
Now I can try and help and influence in new and I think more effective ways.
I know this doesn't happen every day, but I mean, we have you and Glenn here together. You two are now tied, to each other for the rest of your lives. There have been all types of analogies, comparisons. I've heard this is the Woodward and Bernstein of the 21st century. You are his deep throat of the 21st century. What do you say about this linking of you two? Basically for eternity. I mean, is this a something that you see as a powerful force for all of us in the free world?
So I think there's always going to be talk about connections between sources and journalists, but really it's amazing to me how much attention has been paid broadly to me as a personality, to me as a source. When you think about it, at the end of the day, I'm not particularly important. My opinions are not particularly important. I simply focused as the mechanism of revelation of information to journalists who could then go about and do their work. There are other sources throughout the government. There are other sources throughout private industry. There are other sources around the world who are constantly going to be doing this. The focus on me, the focus on big names like Glenn Greenwald, Woodward and Bernstein, it's politically very helpful in individual cases, but I'm a little concerned about the collective impact broadly. Glenn, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been one of the very few differences that Ed and I have had from the beginning about how we think about this, which is, he always said from the start, I remember in Hong Kong him saying all the time, oh, I want to make sure that the focus isn't going to be on me. And I remember saying, I don't really think that's a realistic aspiration. And I actually, thought that although it was really important, I mean, it was extremely important to him that the focus not be on him at the expense of the revelations and the substance. And I think that largely because he stayed out of the media limelight, the focus was on the substance. And it was an incredible choice he made. But I also do think that the example of Edward Snowden and the effect that he had on everybody around him, not just me and Laura, but The Guardian and other media outlets, is really important because it shows the effect that even ordinary individuals like Edward Snowden, who, although we all know his name now, 2 years ago, no one knew his name.
Right.
He hadn't finished high school. He was working inside a large corporation. He grew up with no wealth or privilege or prestige, and he changed the world through an act of conscience and affected lots of other people, including me, and then lots of other people with this spirit. And I think that's a really important model because it's easy. We like to think sometimes we can't really confront injustices, and I think he showed us a really powerful example of actually how it can be, and I think that is an important part of the story.
Edward, you have said that you are afraid that if you do go back to the United States, that there are people who want to have you killed, who do not want you to survive. Do you still worry about that?
I'm not sure I said that. That was actually published in a newspaper report.
Are you concerned about that? Are you concerned about that if you were to go home?
I'm not, because that's really no different than it is anywhere I am in the world. When you do something controversial, you're going to make enemies. When you anger powerful people, there's going to be a desire for retaliation, a desire to sort of project force and to present to the public some kind of deterrent effect. But you can't worry about that, or you'll never be able to do anything.
Right.
You'll never be able to make any kind of decision of any kind of consequence, because you're going to be concerned about what other people might do. Yes, there's, actually, I would say a quite reasonable possibility that somebody might try to do me harm at some point in the future. But, I don't think about tomorrow. I don't think about the week later. I don't think about a month from now. I think about today. What can I do now? What can I do when I get out of bed in the morning to try to make these problems a little bit smaller? What can I try to do to enforce our rights a little bit better, not just here in Germany, not in the United States, but around the world, in places like China, in places like Russia, in places like Latin America, like Africa, like France and Belgium, because this is not a national problem. This is a global problem that we're all going to have to face, or we're going to lose control over government. We're not going to be able to direct and dictate the policies that we want our societies to pursue.
We're running out of time here. You have an audience here, a room full of very savvy tech people who have come to see you today. And you've got a captive audience right now. Edward, what would you like to say to them?
I think one of the biggest things that has not been well covered in the press is that we're seeing systemic attacks on the fabric of our systems, the fabric of our communications, the internet, not just as a target, but as an infrastructure. By undermining the security of our communications, they enable surveillance. A lot of people have talked about sort of a balance between security and privacy. But what the reality of the challenge is not security versus privacy, it's security versus surveillance. Surveillance is not possible when our movements and communications are safe, when they're protected. A satellite can't see you when you're inside your home, but an unprotected computer with an open webcam can. And we know for a fact that the GCHQ, the United Kingdom's NSA, has developed programs to allow them to use those webcams to intercept our private moments within the walls of our home. That program is called Optic Nerve. It was reported in The Guardian. We know that they've hacked into critical infrastructure providers like the Belgian national telecommunications provider, Belgacom. We know they hacked Gemalto, which is a SIM card manufacturer, to try to get the keys that are used for local data encryption from you to the cell phone tower, to the service provider. And that affects not one person, not 10 people, not thousands of people, but millions of people. And this is happening more and more and more. And despite the fact that we need to be thinking about ways to prevent this, because it doesn't just enable our intelligence services, it doesn't just enable our security bureaus to monitor us. It allows foreign adversaries to do the same thing. Now, this is a critical principle. When we talk about security and surveillance, there is no golden key that allows only good guys to read the communications of only terrorists. The only way that we can allow mass surveillance to occur is if we are all more or less electronically naked. And these are the policies that are being pursued right now. In the United Kingdom, I think I have a note on this, actually. There is I'll have to actually hold off on that. There is a draft law that authorizes what's called equipment interference in the United Kingdom under their law. This is a euphemism for hacking. And within the text of the draft law, it quite literally states that people who are going to be hacked are not only targets of active intelligence efforts. It's not that they're looking for terrorists. It's not that they're looking for bad guys. It's that they're looking for people with access to infrastructure. They're looking for service providers. They're looking for systems administrators. They're looking for engineers. They're looking for the people who are in this room right now. You are the target, not because you're a terrorist, not because you're suspected of any criminal wrongdoing, but because you have access to systems, you have access to infrastructure, you have access to the private records of people's private lives, and these are the things that they want. It is important for us to come together and prevent that from happening. That can't happen only in law, or that's not going to be respected as soon as our communications cross the border. That's not going to be happening where we're going to get sort of a magical liberalization in authoritarian societies. We have to enforce our rights through technology as well. We have to enforce it through standards. And that means end-to-end encryption. We have to protect communications while they're in transit. We have to improve the security of the endpoints. And we have to make this transparent to users. This is a distinguisher. There was a poll that was just published a day or two ago that said something like 52% of people in the United States are concerned about this government surveillance. And something like 40% of them, 30% of them have taken steps to change their habits. The headline described this as few have changed their habits in the wake of surveillance. But when we think about 50% of our societies, when we think about 30% of our societies, when we think about 10% of our societies, these are millions and hundreds of millions of individuals who are looking for a way to feel safe.
Yes.
People in this room who can make us feel safe have a new and competitive product that nobody else in the world has. If you can provide safety, if you can provide, you will not work against the interests of the user and their societies. You will have a competitive service and you will have the moral standing, I think, to compete in the domain of policy to make this a standard, not just here at home, but for people who really need it, people who are truly vulnerable, journalists, activists, whistleblowers, and people involved in civil resistance in deeply authoritarian areas.
Okay. Edward, thank you very much. And can I just ask, when you are able to leave Russia, would you and Glenn please come and talk to us here in person on center stage at the CeBIT Global Conferences? Can I get a yes from you now?
Sure. Let's ask Angela Merkel first if she'll allow me entrance.
Well, all right.
Thank you very much.
All right. All right, Glenn, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you again to Edward, and thank you all for sticking with us for the whole hour. And don't forget, there will be a book signing event outside in just a couple of minutes. Thank you very much. Ben, that was great. Thank you.
That was great.
You were good. You were good.
Thank you.